So I got an email from one of my subscribers, Jackie. Hi, Jackie. Who emailed me to say that she just had chicks shipped to her, 25 of them, and within hours they were dying en masse, which is heartbreaking completely. I can't imagine what it's like to go through that, so my heart really goes out to you, Jackie. But sadly, I hear this exact same story all too often with shipped chicks. But Jackie spoke to a hatchery who told her the reason her chicks all died, that had nothing to do with shipping. It was because she didn't use a heat lamp. Jackie instead set her ambient temperature in her brooding room to 75 degrees, and then she used a brooder heating plate for additional warmth, which has always been my recommendation. But this hatchery Jackie spoke to, they sent her to a video put up by Cackle Hatchery where the representative makes this heat lamp claim.
They've been through 2 days of transit, so they have lost some body mass, they've been stressed, and they require a lot more heat on arrival.
He goes on to say, never ever use a brooder plate for your newly arrived shipped chicks.
For male or chicks, we're not talking about when you're hatching at home, we're talking about when you are ordering chicks through the mail, day-old baby chicks. You cannot start them off with a heat plate like these, okay?
You need a heat lamp.
We say that you have to have, in order to have success, you need a brooder reflector lamp, something like this one.
And you need to heat the floor level to, he says, 100 to 105 degrees.
And then, of course, they got to have a lot of room to get away from the heat. But you want about 100 to 105 degrees at the floor level for the baby chicks.
That's really hot. Standard practice for a heat lamp is 95 degrees for the first week, so Cackle Hatchery is recommending up to 10 degrees hotter than that. That's huge. And so Jackie wanted to know my take on that, and I told her initially I was very skeptical of that claim because even though I don't ship chicks myself, I always buy local. There are lots of people who do, lots of people, and nobody ever says that. When you look at the info from other major chick shipping hatcheries, they all say that you can use either the heat lamp or a brooder heat plate. So for example, let's take a look at one of the best known backyard chicken hatcheries out there, Murray McMurray.
Talk about some chickies, so when you get them from the mail or pick them up here, that'd be, what do you do with them?
His recommended heat source for newly arrived shipped chicks.
So I've got two different heating plate brooders set up. So these are radiant heat brooders.
And then he goes on to say that if you are going to use a brooder plate, the ambient temperature in your room needs to be warm enough. How warm is warm enough? At least 50 degrees.
They need to be in an area that's about 50 degrees or warmer.
Totally different, right? From what Cackle Hatchery is saying. Let's look at what other major hatcheries say. Meyer Hatchery, they say to use a brooder heat plate or traditional heat lamp. My Pet Chicken, they say actually the opposite of what Cackle Hatchery is saying. They come out against heat lamps altogether, saying, instead, they recommend brooder heat plates or a similar type heater like a speeder heater. On top of that, Gail Damerow, who's probably the best known backyard chicken expert out there, she also says you can use either a heat lamp or a brooder plate, but that brooder plates are safer than heat lamps. And then there's the backyard chicken bloggers, the ones who tend to be more science and empathy based towards chickens and who do order shipped chicks for themselves. They all say not to use a heat lamp if you can help it. So why is Cackle Hatchery saying the opposite of everybody else, that you should never use a brooder plate, that chicks require a heat lamp? Is there anything to that? Could that be why Jackie's chicks died? And do you need to use a heat lamp for your shipped chicks? To answer this, I did what I always do. I jumped into the scientific research and I was surprised and, to be honest, somewhat distressed by what I found. So there's actually a ton of research on this topic because you know who cares about the hazards of shipping chicks? Factory farmers. Yep. Factory farmers lose money when their shipped chicks either die or are permanently stunted by the stresses of shipping. So university poultry scientists have worked hand in hand with factory farmers to try to save them money, which means that we have a mountain of modern studies around the topic of shipping chicks. In this video, I'm only scratching the surface as far as the science goes because there's just too much. But if you do want to know the full story on shipping chicks, or if you're skeptical about anything I have to say here, check out my blog post on the topic. I detailed all the science there, and every little thing I say is cited, so you can easily find the papers and see for yourself if you want. Okay, here's how the rest of this video is gonna go. I'm gonna cover the two things, just two, that you absolutely need to know from the research science about shipping chicks. Then, spoiler alert, I'm gonna tell you why I think Cackle Hatchery is onto something here, and that shipped chicks may need more heat than a brooder plate alone can provide. And lastly, I'm gonna give you my recommendations for how much more heat your shipped chicks need compared to non-shipped chicks, and how to do that safely. Let's jump in. The two things you need to know about your shipped chicks. Number one, shipped chicks are hungry chicks. Let's start with what I call the myth of the all-nourishing egg yolk sac. I'm sure you've heard it. It goes something like this. Newly hatched chicks are born with some of the yolk material from their eggs still available for sustenance. It's in their abdomens. And this yolk sac will completely nourish them for 72 hours without any additional food or water. Have you heard that? Well, here's the truth. Yes, they are born with this internal egg yolk sac, but this yolk sac was never meant to be the sole source of feed for a baby chick for 3 days. It's a complement to feed, not a substitute for feed. And in fact, the egg yolk sac's supposed to provide only about 30% of the total energy and protein intake of a chick, all right? Not 100%, 30%. The other 70% is supposed to come from outside food. And chicks, given the choice, they'll start eating just a few hours after hatch, not 72 hours later. The research shows that if chicks are deprived of food, they'll have lost significant weight by the time they're just 48 hours old. They'll weigh considerably less than what they're supposed to weigh had they gotten the food and water that they needed. But what about food in the shipping box? So I have seen a lot of YouTube videos where hatcheries will put GroGel into the shipping box. This is a green nutritional gel. Some hatcheries might even throw in a scoop of feed, but then they close the box. The problem here is that chicks are really unlikely to eat and drink in the dark of that closed box. Factory farm hatcheries know this. Some factory farm hatchery delivery trucks, they'll stop after just 6 hours of transport. They'll stop in usually a climate-controlled building. They'll unstack every single chick box. They will open it up. They'll put the nutritional gel, GroGel or hydrogel, depending on the brand. They'll put it in the four corners of every shipping box, and then they give the chicks 2 full hours of light to eat before they close them back, stack it back in, and go on with shipping. That's what it takes to feed chicks during shipping. And even the owner of Murray McMurray Hatchery, we saw him earlier, even he admits that the chicks likely aren't eating the gel during shipping. He said in an interview,
"Does it do anything in the transport boxes?" I think it's kind of defeated by just the sheer number of birds. I'm not saying they're like crowded, but typically it just gets stepped on and then kind of mushed down.
And then he added this.
I'm not convinced that it does a whole, anything as far as keeping them alive in transport, but it
which
does
is
help.
important.
Yeah.
Keeps the phone from ringing.
Yeah.
Last thing about hungry chicks before we move on to number 2. If the temperature or humidity conditions aren't ideal during shipping, which is quite common, chicks' resources will be depleted even faster. The chicks are already losing weight when they don't eat, even in good conditions where they're not shipped. But then when you add shipping stresses on top of it, those chicks just get more and more dehydrated and starved as they use up all of their limited resources trying to deal with those stresses. Okay, so that's the first thing you absolutely need to know. Shipped chicks are hungry chicks. The second thing, hungry chicks are cold chicks. One older study found that the hungrier newly hatched chicks get, the lower their body temperature drops. That's true even if they've been raised since hatch in a 90 to 95 degree brooder. So never been subjected to the stresses of shipping, only ever lived in a toasty warm brooder, and they still get really cold just from not having had food. More recent studies have supported the finding that hungry chicks are cold chicks, and one group of scientists has said that if we take all of these studies together, all the information from all these studies, it leads to the hypothesis that a delay in feed access from the moment of hatch onwards impairs the thermoregulatory abilities of newly hatched chicks, including that if no feed can be provided after hatch for whatever reason, climatic conditions have to be adapted towards a higher environmental temperature to preserve the quality of the chick when placed on the farm. In other words, if chicks are being deprived of food, they need more heat. Ideally, they would be getting additional heat during transport, but unlike most factory farm chicks, backyard chicks aren't shipped in climate-controlled trucks to ensure their health and safety. Backyard chicks are instead shipped as mail in mail trucks and in the cargo holds of airplanes, where they are subjected to extremes of temperature and humidity. That's the gist of what you need to know. Shipped chicks are hungry chicks, and hungry chicks are cold chicks. Therefore, shipped chicks are cold chicks. So if we take this back to my subscriber Jackie's story, this all starts to make some sense. It took her chicks almost 3 days to get to her, and we know from the research, I didn't cover it here, but you can read it in my blog post, we know that 72 hours is way too long for shipping chicks. The risk for death goes up considerably after just 48 hours. Jackie's chicks also were transported in the winter during harsh conditions. We know harsh conditions further deplete the already depleted resources of food-deprived chicks. Then, when Jackie's chicks arrived, a couple of them were too weak to even stand, and I'm gonna leave out the specific details of what Jackie had to witness because it's quite distressing, but her description of her chicks perfectly matches the descriptions in the research studies of chicks who are starving to death. The research considers there to be 3 stages of starvation for chicks. I suspect most of Jackie's chicks were in starvation stages 1 and 2. The couple who couldn't stand were likely in starvation stage 3, and they're so far gone at that point, I don't know that there's anything you could do to save chicks that are in that stage. But the rest of Jackie's chicks, she said that when she first took them out of the box, they seemed to look and act okay, but then they didn't want to leave the heat of the brooder plates. So even though they were starving at 2 to 3 days old, they were choosing to huddle under the heater plate rather than to get food. Part of that's likely because they've never been exposed to food before, so they don't know that food will relieve their hunger. That's something they actually have to learn by eating. But the other part of that is the research suggests that the urge to warm up may be a stronger urge for chicks than the urge to eat. Jackie tried several times to get her chicks interested in food, and they just weren't. And I also found in the research that if shipped chicks are exposed to too much cold or too much heat, even for a short period of time, some of those chicks will just never learn to eat. No matter what, they'll just not eat and they will die. And after Jackie lost 22 of her 25 chicks, She did decide to put a heat lamp in her brooder, and those last 3 chicks, they survived. And that makes me wonder if some of Jackie's other chicks could have survived too if they were just able to warm up enough to choose to eat. It is just too windy out there. You can still hear it on the plastic, but I had to come into the run. Oop. So I can't say for sure whether any of Jackie's other chicks would have lived had they just had a heat lamp to begin with, but it is a definite possibility. And after reviewing all of the research, a little of it I shared here, you can read more of it in my blog post, but after reviewing all of it, I think for shipped chicks who are a little older because they took a little longer to get there, or they had a little tougher conditions than usual, or they were just a little weaker to begin with for whatever reason, I think a warmer brooder may be the difference between life and death for those chicks. And for all the other shipped chicks, the majority of them who aren't in that horrible condition, they'll likely benefit from a warmer brooder as well, because the research does give us every reason to believe that their body temperatures are lower than they should be. So I am changing my recommendation for shipped chicks. In the past, I've always recommended a brooder heat plate in a brooder room with an ambient temperature of about 75 degrees. For shipped chicks, I'm now recommending still a brooder plate, but I'm recommending you crank that ambient temperature up in your room. I would do that with a space heater because I am terrified of heat lamps, but you do what you need to do. If you are using a heat lamp, I would just follow the normal heat lamp instructions and make the warmest part of the brooder around 95 degrees for the first week. Cackle Hatchery, you'll remember they recommend making the warmest part of that brooder 100 to 105 degrees, but they are assuming that you have a large brooder. So you can do that if your brooder is large enough that your chicks can get away from that heat. But most brooders for backyard chickens are kind of small, especially for that first week. I even recommend keeping them smaller so the chicks don't have to go far for food and water. And if you do have a smaller one like that, 100 to 105 degrees, they could overheat and die. But if you're like me and you don't want to use a heat lamp, plug in that brooder plate and then get that ambient temperature up to 95 degrees if you can. And in order to get it that high, this might mean temporarily brooding your chicks in a smaller room, like a bathroom or a closet. I keep that ambient temperature at about 95 degrees for a few hours, maybe 3 to 4 hours, and I constantly supervise the chicks to make sure that they're not showing signs of being too warm, in which case, of course, you need to lower the temperature. But otherwise, keep it up there, and if your chicks are eating and acting normal after a few hours at 95 degrees, I would then lower it to 90 degrees. Because remember, you do still have that brooder heat to give them extra heat if they need it. You just want to make sure that your chicks are warm enough that they're able to be getting a lot of food. Then, if your chicks are still doing well after a few hours at 90 degrees, I'd lower it to 85 degrees, and I'd just leave that ambient temperature at 85 degrees for at least a few days. And then if everyone's looking really healthy, I'd work on gradually lowering that ambient temperature from there. At any of those stages, you could keep your temperature hotter for longer if you felt your chicks needed it, or if you lowered that ambient temperature and it seemed like your chicks were spending too much time under the brooder plate, they're not eating enough, then raise that temperature again. This unfortunately isn't an exact science. You'll need to monitor your chicks' behavior and then make changes from there. So why is Cackle Hatchery the only major hatchery out there saying that shipped chicks need more heat? You'll remember from the beginning of this video that other major hatcheries and backyard chicken experts are saying that you can use either a heat lamp or a brooder plate. some are saying you should only use a brooder plate, never a heat lamp. And then they're saying that the ambient temperature of the brooder space, if you are using a brooder plate, that ambient temperature only needs to be 50 or 60 degrees, depending on who you talk to.
They need to be in an area that's about 50 degrees or warmer.
That's what they're all saying. Why do they think that's warm enough? For the same reason I thought 75 degrees was warm enough. Because it usually is. Because the majority of shipped chicks usually aren't on the brink of death. The majority of shipped chicks can go warm up under that brooder plate and then come out and eat and drink just fine. They might start out a little bit weaker, but they catch up. It's when you get shipped chicks who are a little bit older when they get to you, or who have gone through particularly brutal shipping conditions, or who are just a little bit weaker for whatever reason. It's those chicks whose lives just might be saved by a warmer brooder. But the truth is, you never know what your shipped chicks have been through, which is why I recommend always playing it safe and raising that ambient temperature every time you have chicks shipped. And if you do have shipped chicks coming your way, keep an eye out for my next video. I'll be giving a whole lot more recommendations on how to best set up your brooder to help shipped chicks thrive. In the meantime, check out my video here and linked below on how not to kill your chicks. You'll learn the 13 most common beginner mistakes. It's my most popular video yet, and it's a must-see if you're new to chickens. Happy chickening!